Real gross domestic product, or GDP, is a measure of the value of all newly produced goods and services in a country during some period of time, adjusted for changes in prices over time. Note, the adjective real means that the GDP has already been adjusted to remove the effects of prices over time. Economic growth is an upward trend in real GDP, reflecting an expansion in economy over time. Economic fluctuations are swings in the real GDP that lead to deviations of the economy from its long-term trend. This figure plots the United States real GDP measured in billions of change $2,000 from 1970 to 2005. The straight black line shows the growth trend in United States real GDP through time. Notice that the actual real GDP numbers fluctuate around the trend. The vertical shaded bars mark the 6 recessions experienced by the economy since 1970. Thicker shaded bars represent longer recession periods. A closer look shows that the value of goods and services produced in the US economy almost tripled in value over the last 35 years. During this period, the United States economy grew by 3% per year. In fact, in 2004, the United States real GDP was larger than the economies of Japan, the world's second largest economy at that time, and Germany, the world's third largest economy at that time, combined. This figure shows that the United States economy in 2004 roughly equaled the sum of the GDP of Japan and Germany in 2004 plus the United States GDP in 1969. Business cycles are the ups and downs in GDP experienced by an economy. They are what we call economic fluctuations. There are 4 phases of the business cycle. There's a peak, a recession, a trough, and a recovery. A recession is a decline in real GDP that lasts for at least 6 months. A peak is the highest point in real GDP before a recession. A trough is the lowest point in real GDP at the end of a recession. Expansion is the period between the trough of the recession and the next peak, consisting of a general rise in output and employment. Recovery is the early part of an economic expansion immediately after a recession. This figure illustrates the phases of the business cycle around the 2001 recession in the United States. One could say that the recession in 2001 was relatively mild, as evidenced by the small drop in the real GDP and the relatively short time span between the peak and the trough. Here is a list that compares the recessions in the US economy from 1920 to 2001. The shortest period of recession in US history was between July 1990 and March of 1991. It was followed by the longest period of expansion in United States history, 120 months. The longest recession since the 1920s was during the Great Depression, when the economy was in recession for 43 months. Recessions versus depressions. A depression is a prolonged and deep recession. Note that there is no formal definition for a depression. A depression is just a very long recession. The Great Depression was the depression experienced by the United States from August 1929 to March 1933. During this period, real GDP fell by 32.6%. Here is an illustration of the real GDP fluctuations during the 20th century in 1996 dollars. The size of the recessions are small relative to the Great Depression. Unemployment rate is the percentage of the labor force that is unemployed. The labor force are workers who are either working or looking for work. Those who are working are considered employed, and those who are looking for work are unemployed. Unemployed are workers who are willing to work at a given wage but cannot find a job. This figure shows the unemployment rate for the United States from 1970 to 2005. Note that the unemployment rate increases at or around the time the United States experiences a recession. This figure illustrates the unemployment rate throughout the 20th century. Note that the unemployment rate for the United States was almost 25% during the height of the Great Depression. This figure shows the behavior of the unemployment rate after 2001. The recession began in March 2001 and ended in November of 2001, but the unemployment rate continued to rise after 2002. Inflation rate is the percentage increase in the overall price level over a given period of time, usually 1 year. This figure shows the ups and downs in the inflation rate from 1970 to 2004. Note that the inflation rate usually drops during or immediately after a recession. The interest rate is the amount received per dollar loaned per year. It's usually expressed as a percentage of the total loan. There are 4 different types of interest rates. There is the mortgage interest rate, which is the rate on loans to buy a house. There is savings deposit interest rate, which is the rate people get on their savings deposits at banks. There's a treasury bill rate, which is the interest rate the government pays when it borrows money from people for 1 year or less. And then there's the federal funds rate. This is the interest rate banks charge each other on very short-term loans. Here illustrates the behavior of the interest rates from 1970 to 2004. In this graph, this is the federal funds rate. A closer look shows that interest rates tended to rise just before a recession and then declined during and just after the recession. Real interest rate is the interest rate minus the expected rate of inflation. It adjusts the nominal interest rate for inflation. The nominal interest rate is the interest rate uncorrected for inflation. Potential GDP is the economy's long-term growth trend for real GDP. It is determined by the available supply of capital, labor, and technology. Real GDP fluctuates above and below the potential GDP. Potential GDP of an economy is given by its aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is the total value of all goods and services produced in the economy by the available supply of labor, capital, and technology. It's also called potential GDP. Labor is the number of hours people are available for work in producing goods and services. Capital is the factories, improvements to cultivated land, machinery and other tools, equipment, and structures used to produce goods and services. Technology is anything that raises the amount of output that can be produced with a given amount of labor and capital. A production function is the relationship that describes output as a function of labor, capital, and technology. Fiscal policy is the government policy concerning taxing, spending, and borrowing. These policies are intended to mitigate the negative impact on aggregate demand of other factors, such as a fall in investor or consumer confidence. Monetary policy is a government policy concerning the money supply and the control of inflation and money. These policies are also intended to slow down spending, aggregate demand, when the economy is rising too fast, and increase spending, aggregate demand, when the economy is in a recession. Aggregate demand is the total demand for goods and services by consumers, businesses, government, and foreigners. According to the theory of economic fluctuations, changes in the real GDP above and below the potential GDP in the short run are caused by changes in the aggregate demand.